We are back, and this is chapter 2 in this series of videos on God. And this chapter is the history of God, and the history of how we came up with the concept of God as we understand the concept today, which is as a person that we cannot perceive that created the world and controls the world in some way. Okay, and there's different versions of that, but that's essentially what people mean by God. So let's get to it, to the beginning of history. So let's go back to the caveman days, okay? And let's take our first people. And, what were they concerned with? They were concerned with survival initially. And so that was their main occupation of their thinking, probably, like where to find the animals and to hunt and to get to know the seasons and what are, so that they could be at the right place when it got cold or when it got too hot. And so the initial questions that such people asked as they developed language and thought is probably questions about survival and comfort, which is what they're looking for. But as they got more comfortable over time and had what they need, there was some downtime. And the next order of question that they would have asked would have been philosophical questions. And some of the simplest philosophical questions that we begin to ask are questions of causation. How did this get here? So we look around at our environment, our world, and we look up at the stars, and they're like lights that light up the night, and in the day there's the sun and it lights up the day. And there's mountains and there's streams, and where does the water come from? And even ourselves, where did we come from? People. So the animals, the people, the stars, the earth, the trees, nature. Where does it all come from? How does it originate? And that's the beginning of the question of why is it here? Why am I here? So these are questions of origin. And let's take our first caveman that starts thinking like this. Imagine him. Let's call him Ugg. That's kind of a joke, but that's a name that's often used in cartoons and so forth for a caveman. And our caveman Ugg, he starts to ask, where's this come from? What's the cause? Now, he assumes naturally that something caused it. And we're going to get into that because there's a problem in that assumption, but it's not something that he could have seen past that many years ago, maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago. So it was perfectly reasonable to ask, what caused this? What's the cause? Or who caused it? Who or what? And so where does he have to look for this cause, this who or this what? Well, pointless to look around in the world. I mean, I guess he could do that, but that doesn't make sense because he would, if it was some rock or some tree that was creating all this, and he would see it creating more of it, and he doesn't. So it's something he doesn't see. So where can he look for this? The only place he has to look for that cause is his imagination. And so what does he see when he looks into his imagination? What do any of us perceive when we look and focus on our imagination? We perceive things that we've perceived before. So really they're memories. Now you can mix them up, but they're things that we've seen. So when he looks for the cause, he sees things that he's seen, like animals and so forth. And he can put together this animal with this animal in his mind, or this person and this animal, and he can create various creatures, but they're basically creatures built up out of the material of his memories. And that's what's in your what your imagination is. When you dream, you're really dreaming things that you've perceived before, and mixing them up too. So you could. It's not hard to imagine a mouse with 1,000 heads, but you've seen heads and you've seen mice. You're just putting them together. So in the beginning, he began to postulate that there were things that he didn't see, like the things that he does, that were invisible to him. And they were very powerful, and they created this. And those were the first spirits. And the first spirits, from what I've read, they're animal spirits. And so he would worship these too, because by worshiping and what's called propitiate the spirits, that means do something to please them. You gain favors. So if they control the weather and you propitiate them, then the weather might be better, which could be good, for crops and so forth, or even for hunting. And so that's what he did. And he had these spirits, and in time, he mixed these up. Of course, different cultures, they had these animal spirits, and sometimes they were half animal, half human, as I said before. But slowly, the animal side of these spirits started to diminish, and they became human, entirely human. And we know that because later in history, we know about the animal spirits from our art, or we think that might be what they are depicting. But then by the time you get to the Greeks, let's say, they had a pantheon of human gods, and they were also basically on the same idea. They're based upon memory of people, and people are the most powerful thing, and so though the people are projected, our memories are projected into this invisible world, and everything. This is the responsibility of those gods. That's how you explain everything. Everything is explained like that. And of course, if you're projecting memories of people, onto this pantheon of invisible people, you're going to bring with that a lot of the attributes of people. And people, of course, are jealous and envious and cunning and lustful and greedy and all kinds of things like that, and competitive. And the Greek gods, well, they were all those things. And but over time, and this isn't exactly chronological because we don't know when Zoroaster lived, but there was a teacher named Zoroaster. Some people call him a philosopher. Others a kind of messiah, but he established a religion called Zoroastrianism, and he said that there weren't a lot of gods. There were other entities, but there was one main god, and that's the beginning of what we call monotheism. I'm sorry I'm taking so long. Everybody already kind of knows all this, but there's a point to it that I'm going to get to when I go over what the flaw in the thinking was, of the originating these visions we have of God as a person. Then, of course, Jesus came and he talked about his father, and that was very similar to this Zoroastrian idea of a one creator. And then after Jesus, there was Muhammad, and his teaching was sort of founded on Judaism, which is a monotheistic religion, and Christianity. And Islam means submission, and the main creed of the religion was that men should submit to God, who they called Allah, which is just another name for the Lord, that comes from the Aramaic. And so here we are. Now let's go over what I say is the thinking that was not so obvious, but it was natural to have happened. Okay, so let's go back to Ugg. Now Ugg imagines these people because He's seen people, and when you go to imagine something, that's all kind of all you have, you know. Um, Nothing else would have occurred to him. Had to be something or someone. So he had to make them up because they weren't forthcoming, what they were. And so, but there is an actual fallacy in this thinking that it wasn't dumb, because the thinking that would have been an alternative has only come about in very modern times. So all through ancient times, when you looked for a cause of something, you looked for often something like the thing that was caused, but the difference is that it's an invisible one. So, for instance, Plato, he wanted to explain how it is we recognize cups. There's this cup and there's this cup. They're very different. So how do we recognize both of them as cups? Well, he postulated that we have a memory from another invisible world that we can't see, and there existed the perfect cup. And so when I see this, I'm reminded. It's a very funny theory, but I'm reminded of the perfect cup I saw in this invisible world before I took birth on the earth, and that's how I know it's a cup. And this one also reminds me of that, so I know this is a cup too. And those were called forms. And so how do we explain our recognition of these cups is because there's another cup. Now that's about recognition. It's not how we get cups, but in a way it is, because these are all the shadows of the real cup in the world of forms. So that was one. Now Aristotle, he wanted to explain perceiving things, and he was smart enough to realize that our perception of things was not the thing in itself, because you could have 100 people around here and they're all having a perception of this inside themselves somehow, and there isn't 100 pairs of glasses here. There's just one. So there must be another pair of glasses somewhere besides the one that we're experiencing within. Now, when I say experiencing in here, even the Greeks could understand that these glasses don't pass through your eyeball into to see them, and that our experience of this that occurs when we perceive with our eyes, and the same can be repeated of all our senses. Our experience of this is what he called a phantasm. It's like a kind of it's a representation of what's out here in the outer world, but it's in our soul, if you want, or our mind. It became, and even in modern times we say it's occurring in our brain, the experience, even in modern neuroscience. But that experience that we're having is not the actual outer world. It's a representation of it. It stands for, it lets us know it's there. But if we only perceive our own experience, how do we know there's this outer world? And how do we know that our experience, like my experience of this pair of glasses, how do I know that that phantasm, as Aristotle called it, is like the one outside my head? Because I only have direct access to my experience of it. And by the way, it doesn't help that I can feel this with my hands, because even that tactile experience is occurring in me. Something that supposedly travels through our nerves and goes to our brain, and there you get the experience of that tactile sensation. So it's still, how do you compare your tactile sensation with the thing? And also the pair of glasses isn't just a pair of just tactile sensations, is it? It's more than that. So we essentially end up with a theoretical, invisible world. Now notice that that's very similar to Ugg, who came up with these spirits like things he saw, and they had to be invisible because he was trying to explain the visible or the perceivable, and so they had to be imperceivable. And so he created an invisible world full of these spirits. Well, the same thing even in Aristotle and Plato. Plato had his invisible world of forms. We can't see it directly. How do we know that there's a world of forms? We infer it from our experience. The same with Aristotle. How do we know there's this outer world with this outer pair of glasses? Because we make inference from our internal representation, our experience that's mental and in us. Now, this problem of not being able to compare our experience with the so-called outer or real or external world is called the mind-body problem. And I recommend or invite anybody to look it up. There's a little article in Wikipedia, and you can find it anywhere. It's a very old problem. Even the term mind-body is really language from the Enlightenment, and we use the words mind and body a little differently today. So it's kind of a relic, the name. I like to call it the two-world view problem, or the invisible world problem. That's what I call it. And so now, even in contemporary neuroscience, the same thing appears. So I would just repeat what I did with Aristotle. The only difference is I would say that the processes that are producing, according to neuroscience, the experience of this pair of glasses is chemical and electrical activity occurring within the neurons of my brain. You can show, there are lots of animations online that show activity in the brain. But the mind-body problem is not solved by having a lot of neuroscience that we can point to, because when we point to those are things in the experience. Those neurons on that brain, you can cut open a brain, you can put electrodes on it, and you're going to have stuff on it. An electroencephalogram is going to show, the different firings in the brain on a screen. But all that is part of the phenomenon, part of our experiential world. What we want to know is, how did something that's not experienced produce our experiential world? Now you could go, well, Chris, you don't understand. It's kind of like a car, You put all the parts together, and you put in some gasoline, and you ignite it with a spark plug, and then it creates the power to drive. It's not applicable, because everything I just described is part of our experience. We experience gasoline, we experience all the parts of the motor, the car, and we experience its driving. But in the case of, we're not trying to explain how you put together this and this in the phenomenal world and you get this in the phenomenal world. That's very easy. I could explain how I made, this cup out of plastic in a mold. But I can't. But when I'm trying to explain how my experience suddenly came about, no one even has a theory for how that happened. All this talk about eyeballs and brains and neurons isn't the same topic. That's some activity that's going on in the phenomenal world. We want to know, how did you get experience at all, conscious experience? So, they talk about how life evolved from some ooze, and there were all the right ingredients, and that finally that supervened into life, which they don't know how that happened, and they can't recreate that in a laboratory, by the way. And then the bigger thing is that later, as this evolves, through all the stages of evolution, at some point it develops consciousness, that it's aware, it's having an aware experience. Nobody knows how that happened. There isn't even a theory. There's theories like property dualism is the name of a. It's not really a theory. It's a position in philosophy, that there are physical states, properties, and then there are experiential properties, and somehow these come together and supervene on these, but they don't know how it happens. And they admit it. There's nobody going around saying that they have found how to solve it. But I think I have, and I'm going to get to that. The problem is the whole way we're doing this, the whole way we're trying to explain our experiential world. And it started back there with Ugg. How else could Ugg have looked around, wondered at the cause of things, and how else could he have framed the question? Remember, the way Ugg framed his question, and you're using Ugg as you get it, as an analogy for the process that we've gone through over the years. Ugg is just a made-up person that we can think about. So Ugg, he asked, what made all this? So this is going to be a little difficult to explain, and I can put notes in and I can link to papers, but I'm going to in the video description, but let's see if I can explain it with words, and without just reading papers that I've written. The mistake Ugg made is he didn't realize that what he was trying to explain was his experience. For the caveman, even the word experience probably didn't exist, and certainly words like consciousness and mind and gestalt and all this psychology is very 20th century, by the way. So he would have just sort of seen things in the world. They're called discrete objects. So I've been showing discrete objects. They're discrete in that they're separate from other ones. They're unique and by themselves, so we can pull them out of everything else, and that's a discrete object. There are different meanings for the word discrete. You can look that up if you want. But this means an individual separated out object. And there's this, and I've been showing a cup. And so he assumes that, well, he's really just asking for the cause of discrete objects, like the stars, the moon, the sun. But let's say he doesn't realize that this whole thing is a phenomenal experience, an experience that he's having. It's a complex experience, but he doesn't think of it that way. Today, an intelligent person could understand what I'm saying. Ugg could probably not have. So it was absolutely ordinary for him to do the following. He abstracted from the fact that there's discrete objects everywhere, that the universe is a discrete object. But when it does sort of seem that way in our imagination, the universe is a thing. And this is a thing, and this is even a physical thing. But the universe is really all, if we took it all, is an experience. Now, you can test this. You can think of everything that you've ever perceived and anything that you ever could perceive and come upon, and that you call the world. If you got on a rocket and you went to Venus, and you walked around, it would be what you perceived. So, no matter how far you went, you couldn't get outside of your experience. So what we mean by the world is an experience. It's a complex and shared experience. You and I are sharing the experience of this that we call the world. But I say that was the beginning of the question, was not understanding that he was explaining a verb, an action. To experience or to perceive is an action. So it comes from the Latin word percipere, which means to perceive. We have our word perceive. And originally the word just means perceive, even your thoughts you perceive, because anything that you become aware of in the original sense of the word perceive in English, it meant that. It meant anything you could perceive. It didn't have to just be a sense perception as we use the word today often in abbreviated dictionaries. But if you go back to an unabridged dictionary, it still has that it means, in the broadest sense, experience. And so, now, had Ugg, which was impossible, looked upon the universe as an experience, he would have asked possibly a very different question. because it's an event, it's an occurrence, it's an ongoing happening, the world, meaning it's an experience that we are sharing. By the way, we find ourselves in that experience. So let's admit that too. So if he admits that, he would ask the question, how did all this happen? Instead of what made this happen, become, or get made, he would ask, how did it all happen? Okay? But he didn't. Now, when we are looking for how something occurred, and it's something that is ongoing, we have a word for that today, which we would not have had in the ancient past, and that is process. So Ugg doesn't know it, but he's asking about experience, which is an action, a verb. And what he's looking for to explain it is the process that brought it about. Some kind of, if this is an event, then it's it has gone through a process from an earlier state of that event. Now, this is how we explain things in the modern world. I'm not sure most people are aware of that, but I'll give an example. Long ago, the Greeks actually had an account that the continents, that as we find them, the shapes, they were shaped by the gods in the beginning of time, you know? So where do we get continents? We got them from these great titans that created them, you know, shaped them. And all the way into modern times, as we began to have more observation in science, we noticed that continents, the shape of continents on a globe, seem to fit together. And so they thought, well, they seem to have drifted apart at some point, because you could take Africa and you could take America and you can put them together and they fit. And so they had this idea of continental drift, that somehow continents were once all together and then they drifted apart, and they're always drifting. But in the 1970s, they developed much more sophisticated tests and experiments, and they developed the theory called plate tectonics, and you can look that up. I'll put a little animation of it. But on one side of the Earth, continental plates one is subducted under the other, going under like this, and at the other side of the Earth, they're splitting apart. And they're moving like this, and they're not really continents moving on the surface of the water, or even on the surface of the bottom of the ocean, but rather it's the whole plate that's moving, and the continent's moving with it. Anyway, that is the accepted view today of what caused the current shape of the continents. Originally, there was one continent called Pangaea, and then through this process, through this plate tectonics, you have this spreading and subducting at the other side of the world. And they find evidence of this now with their modern instruments. And that explains the current condition of the world. An evolution from a simpler state, Pangaea, and unitary, to a complex and plural state of many continents, all part and shaped as they are. Okay, that's enough for this part 2, or chapter 2. In chapter 3, we'll get into the possible process that produced this universe, and then we're going to relate that either in that section or the next to God, and we're going to see, wait a minute, there really does have to be God when we look at it this way, and then I'm going to prove that you have to look at it this way, that the old way is the rational way, and this is actually the rational way. So it's very, very ironic that the scientific thinking with some applied right and the thinking corrected, we actually come to where there isn't just possibility of God, but there has to be God. And in fact, we're going to find out there has to only be God, which is called non-duality in some traditions. So anyway, we'll get on with that in chapter 3, and thank you for being here, and I'll see you there. Bye-bye.